Great. Well, thank you, and I certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to serve as the moderator for this panel, particularly following the enlightening and somewhat scary, in perhaps some respects, the presentation by Eric. So thank you for that. I think it'll add some more additional fodder for our discussion here on the panel. Just as Steve noted, I am the interim chief executive for the GRI, having stepped into the role in early July. And I warned Stephen that I would take the opportunity to have a little bit of a commercial in light of the fact that we had the launch of our new global standards yesterday, and a global launch, and will be followed by a series of launch events around the world over the coming months. And so I would strongly encourage you, if you want to understand what that all means, to visit GRI website, and you can get a preview, a little animation as to just what we've done in terms of trying to position the GRI guidelines as now standards, and it'll fit in very nicely, I think, in our discussion, as well as the kinds of things that we're able to do now with the interrelated standards and their use both collectively and individually to support the kinds of reporting regimes that Eric just talked about from an EU perspective. So I thank Ethical Corp for the opportunity to be here. And well, then I think we'll move quickly and do a quick introductions of each of our panelists, and then we'll get into their discussions, and then hopefully, and I have no doubt, judging from the conversation and the questions that were just fielded, that we'll have lots of questions for the group. So, keeping in mind that what this panel has been asked to do is talk about reporting trends, where are we going. Obviously, with what we just heard from the EU perspective, that's clearly one of the important trends, and there are others. And so we'll also talk about the trends, what the implications are from a corporate perspective, a reporter perspective, and then some perspectives on how IT and how the data, can play into this whole move towards increased transparency by companies. So first, the introduction. So we'll start. Sarah?
Yes, I'm Sarah Gray I'm the Markets Director at the International Integrated Reporting Council, where I've been for, I think, 2.5 years now. But actually I've spent probably the last 27 years in roles related to corporate reporting, originally more related to the sort of rise of global financial reporting, and then moving more to sort of broader corporate reporting in recent years. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Svetlana, I work for Barclays, part of the Citizenship and Reputation team, and it's an utter pleasure to be here with you today. I've been with Barclays for 2 years. Previously I've been a consultant, so I guess I have both two of both worlds.
So hi, I'm Joe Jones. I am the Principal Sustainability Consultant at SustainIT. I've been with the company now for 7.5 years, and talking about all those wonderful things, the big data and how technology helps drive that reporting. I'll keep it brief for now.
Okay, thank you. So Sarah is going to kick us off and provide us some overarching trends and direction.
Great, thank you, and it's really great to be here today. I was just thinking about now, what trends shall we pick up on? And I chose 9 trends. There are probably 109 that we could talk about, but hopefully it'll be some food for thought for today. If I can work this little clicker. Yes, great. So just to kick off, there are many developments and mega trends in the marketplace that we're all aware of, but just a few that are really having a big impact on the sort of direction of travel of corporate reporting, which the Non-Financial Reporting Directive is clearly part of. The first thing we're seeing is a very, very strong calls from all parts of the market for a longer-term focus, longer-termism, more inclusive capitalism. The idea that companies might lose their license to operate if they're just thinking too narrowly about profit. It now is so important for companies to communicate their purpose, their broader purpose as well. And it's coming clearly from investors as well. We heard earlier this year, for example, the CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink, asking the CEOs of companies to clearly lay out a strategic framework for their long-term value creation. And in effect, the IR framework is a tool, is something that can help companies do that and join that together. We're also seeing the rise of multi-capital information. Companies are reporting across all the resources or more of the resources. They're doing sustainability reporting. And we're hearing from academics and other researchers that that is making a difference, that from their research, those companies that are reporting across that broader information are in fact outperforming their peers. There's also the exponential growth of data, and I'm very relieved that Joe is going to talk expertly on that topic, because while I'm aware of it, I'm not an expert there. And the other thing, of course, is disruptive business models, that technology is very much underpinning the rise of sort of new business models, and therefore driving the need for integration and the need for really savvy thinking within businesses to make sure their business models are resilient and evolving if they need to be. So the first trend I wanted to mention was really the reporting landscape. And I think navigating the corporate reporting landscape will get easier, and the relevance of different standards and frameworks will be better understood. And the reason I say this is because GRI and the IRC, for a start, are sitting here on the same panel, but also some of the big international standard setters, such as the ISB and the FASB and CDP and GRI, have got together to establish what they're calling the corporate reporting dialogue. And while that is not going to change the world overnight, it does at least show that the standard setters are talking to each other. And during the year, I think it was actually last year, they produced the corporate reporting landscape map, which is very helpful just in terms of articulating the purpose and the scope of each of the standards and where standards are available across that reporting landscape. So, for example, if you're looking at intellectual capital, where do standards already exist? And if you click on the half circles and the circles, it gives specific standards references. So I think that's quite a significant change, that standard setters are cooperating with each other and understanding that landscape and trying to make it easier for organisations to navigate it. If we move across to integration, I think businesses are really clearly moving, and we heard that not all of them are using IR necessarily. But what we're seeing is, at least 1,000 companies internationally, not necessarily reporting externally in a fully integrated way, but at least thinking about how they do that internally, and how they integrate their sustainability into their strategy, and how they give parity between sort of financial information and other information where it is strategically important for the business. So I think that's an important trend. And I really liked Generali's journey in the corporate reporting evolution. And I think different companies are at different stages on that evolution. But, at the beginning, where companies were saying, or finance teams were saying, my main task is only to make sure that the numbers are right, and moving on from that to making sure that the numbers make sense. And then perhaps where a lot of companies are making sure that they're actually managing the flows of different kinds of information. And then now I think increasingly companies are at that orange stage where they are explaining how they create value across different capitals. And then finally, it's that thinking piece, that they're actually thinking in integrated ways across the different capitals. The third trend is this focus, I think, on value value creation. There will be an increased understanding of how value is created, both within the organisation, within board and employees, and externally to the organisation with providers of financial capital and other stakeholders. And I think this will have a positive impact on capital allocation. One of the surveys that we did, one of the studies that Black Sun helped us with, was to talk to companies who are implementing IR, and one of the first things they talked about was the better understanding of this kind of value creation, of how the organisation was creating value across the different capitals. So the fourth trend is really management information. And what we're seeing actually is some interesting signs of very savvy management and board reporting that companies are sharing, and they want others to learn from their experience. And so, I mean, that links to sort of the information systems that support it. And there's one example here of PwC in the Netherlands, which has actually developed a kind of integrated dashboard that management of PwC Netherlands uses themselves to really understand their key performance indicators and how those are linked. And I think they're also working with quite a lot of Dutch companies and possibly companies elsewhere to help them implement this kind of management dashboard. That's very linked to the fifth trend, which is connectivity. And I think, you know, in successful companies, data will no longer be stuck in silos. And the connectivity of information and the relationships between the different capitals and resources that companies use will be clearer. And the reason I say this is because some companies are already starting to show this. And SAP is a report, their online integrated report is well worth looking at in this respect. And it's very difficult to see at this level, but really they are showing the connectivity between their key performance indicators. And, you know, if you drill down to the level below, for example, you can start to see things like the connection between the training that they're doing, the productivity improvements that has an impact on, the effect that might have on employee retention or does have, and therefore the financial performance. So they're linking across all these things to show the impact of training on their financial performance. That is quite a difficult thing to do, but increasingly companies are starting to do that kind of quite deep connectivity. I think another element of connectivity, and there are many, you know, past, present, and future, and various other things, but Generali again sort of uses this idea themselves that, and I think in the UK a lot of companies do it with their strategic report, is that you have the integrated information that management is saying is the most important information to run the business and therefore for investors to understand about our business. But it's concise and it's short, if possible, and therefore it's not the whole story. It's in a way the strategically important piece. And I don't think we can get away from the fact that there will be a lot of other information that different people will need, regulators, investors, NGOs and others. And so there will be a connection between that central integrated information in an integrated report or a strategic report, and that will be linked online or elsewhere to more detailed financial information, more detailed sustainability information. The big data trend, using big data, it's clear that investment organisations are already using big data, and you know, clever things like natural language processing and all of that kind of thing is informing investor decisions. They are buying or developing internally all the information that they can get their hands on and processing that in savvy ways. But the information that they're gathering is not audited information. So it becomes increasingly important for a company to perhaps use big data themselves, be aware of what's out there, and use it to inform their own decision making about trends in the marketplace or what's out there about themselves. So I think harnessing the power of big data will be a key going forward. The next trend was really just quite a detailed one in a way, that I think there are increasingly clever analytical tools to help assess the maturity and materiality of the information that companies use. And I think I have an example here actually from Indra, and they are now analysing the sources of information that they use for each of their integrated KPIs and assessing the maturity of that data, because of course, you know, financial data is often very mature, very well supported by technology, and there are very different levels of maturity with other data. But this idea that Indra is tracking that and understanding exactly what their next steps are to continue to evolve the maturity of the data they're using, I think is a very interesting development.
Can we wrap up quickly?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's 2 more points to make. So one is the trend on conciseness and future orientation. We've seen General Electric produce a very concise report this year, which is interesting to have a look at. It's not necessarily integrated, but it's a good view from management, and it's 60 pages rather than 300. This is Sanford's annual report. Future-oriented information doesn't have to be hard data predictions, but they do quite a good job of explaining their strategic objectives and what they're planning to do going forward. And I think I will just leave it with a future trend that the chairman of the IRC Council talks about the role of the CFO will be increasingly not just on financial information, as we already know has happened already, but they will be very much the chief value officer. And to leave you with a quote from Tim Hayward, integrated reporting without business integration would be like putting lipstick on a pig. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. So Sarah has laid out some of the big trends, and now we'll get down to some of the more practicalities of it and hear from Barclays. And you can certainly feel free to sit there. You don't need to.
I actually will. I guess a bit of a background, you know, where we're coming from in terms of trends. So Barclays has been reporting sustainability for a decade now, but only 2 years ago we moved to integrate reporting. And when I say move to, it's a journey. So, you know, we're not claiming we're fully integrated. It will take some time. And thank you, Eric. I think you kind of highlighted that it is hard for a company to integrate everything. It starts with systems, goes down to people. But I think what we are seeing now is we try to integrate at the governance and controls level, and I think this is important. So all our disclosures go through the same review process at the year end. We issue everything on the same date. So I think this brings in consistency, and also our sustainability data is much more robust than it used to be 2 years ago. Partly thanks to the processes, partly thanks to assurance, external assurance. And in terms of the actual kind of trends that we are seeing, again, I think our previous speaker, Eric, touched upon this. So we're really watching the space in terms of climate-related financial disclosures, the Financial Stability Board, what they're doing. But this is, I think, partly to do with Barclays being a financial institution. So, but I think it's the first time, actually, that we see that people from the financial world actually starting to look at the climate risk in that specific way. So Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, is very active in this space. Again, Bloomberg. We're really anticipating what the recommendations will be coming up in December, and then follow on in the summer. The other trend that I think we also will be seeing more and more in 5 to 10 years is the reporting on the SDGs, and I think there is a session on this later, I think tomorrow. So yeah, how do companies report on this kind of global universal framework of KPIs that the UN just outlined in front of us? And personally at Barclays, we're still getting our head around this, so really looking forward to some of the kind of knowledge sharing and how do you use this trend. And actually, speaking of the value creation, I think reporting on impact is one of the things that we're looking at. And I think what the London benchmarking group has done previously was a huge success, but this is very limited to the community investment. And now a lot of companies are moving into the, this kind of shared growth, shared value creation agenda. So how do you report on the impact that you are making as a business, again, linked to the social license to operate? So all those things, are critically important. I think we'll see more and more in the integrated reports, but also in the sustainability reports. And to kind of, the robustness of data, as I said, more digital data is coming in. We do need systems in order to integrate everything. So, I guess it's nicely going to Joe.
Okay, thank you. So, Joe.
So I think very quickly, if I do a very brief sales pitch on who SustainIT are, I'm a consultant, I can't help myself. So we are a sustainability data consultancy. So we've been around for 10 years, so as long as you've been reporting, as long as a lot of people have been reporting. And we help our clients with that transition from wanting to do something to do with sustainability and having the systems and the data to be able to do something. I think the way we describe it is we help them get better software, better data and better decisions as a result of that. I think everyone's heard the joke about big data and teenage sex, and no, you've not heard this joke? Okay, so I've seen this now, I think probably about 6 or 7 times, and I've seen it every time attributed to someone else. I didn't make this up. You can find all those names. But it's the big data is like teenage sex. Everyone says they're doing it, but not many people are actually doing it, and those who are doing it probably aren't doing it that well anyway. And there's an awful lot that's true. I mean, big data as a thing is a great term and it's great to throw around, but it's such a fast-moving place. You've got smart meters have started coming into landscape. Now the Internet of Things is touching everything, and then you start to look at how you move things forward from that. I was talking to someone who suggested that the best way to plan audits would be for all these auditors to have GPS coordinates, so he can work out who goes where. It's that level of information. And so how much big data is generated is growing exponentially, which means you're going to need better and better ways to manage that. And that's certainly something we've seen. If you look at the CSR, sustainability, EHS, call it what you like, software market, it's growing massively because there is so much need to be able to manage that. I know there's a few of them out there already. There are some others as well. And I think what really speaks to that is a lot of those companies in the last 12 months have had some pretty significant investment from outside capital. It's because that industry isn't going anywhere. The need and the appetite for more data from investors and from the public and from stakeholders really across the value chain will mean that there's always going to be that want for more and more of that data. So then it becomes a case of, well, how do you manage it effectively? And there are almost 2 different routes to this. The one thing that I think can happen whenever a new technology comes out or a new kind of field starts to develop is the idea that there's the one enterprise level solution that will manage all of that, that you'll get one big piece of technology, one giant thing that will resolve all those problems, that you'll be able to throw all of the data into that system, that it will get all the requirements there, and that it will match everything you need. That's certainly not my experience. I've seen a couple of people shake their heads when I said that as well. What you need is a more agile solution. I think that's where a lot of these softwares are heading. For the most part, you look at 360 and Enablon and Greenstone and ThinkStep and others as well, and they are, for the most part, small companies who have risen up with a passion for answering that question, for finding a route to resolving that technology issue. And so by their very nature, they're quite small, quite agile, quite innovation-driven companies. So as big data's requirements grow, these guys will grow as well, and we're certainly seeing that. But they'll also become more specific. They'll start to evolve what they do to match the questions that they want to answer. And so your need is very much going to be based on, well, this is what we want. How do those software options match that need? How do I find the best, not just technology fit, because they're going to be answering a lot of the same questions, but how do we find the right cultural fit for us? And that's a more interesting question. Obviously, we've talked about opportunities and what big data will do and how that will help and what trends we are seeing. Certainly, what I think the interesting thing is it does allow you better access to data faster. I think the average report delay is about 3 to 4 months now, and that's been going down and going down and going down. But if you've got the right systems in place, or if you're able to get systems in place in the future, then you're not just able to react to things as they're happening, but you're also able to predict what's going to happen. I remember talking to someone about supply chain, which I know is the room over there. And they said one of the most interesting indicators for them about supplies that were a risk for them was staff turnover. Very simple number, very easy to collect, but it indicates that there is something going on at that company that they need to look at. And so it's those leading indicators that big data will get you to. It's the fact that you'll be able to know this much information from the data, and you'll be able to draw these conclusions and be able to react, well, be able to be proactive, you'll be able to act before something happens rather than after something happens. I think that's really one of the interesting things about big data.
Just in my contribution to the trends, because certainly from a GRI standpoint, we also are aware of trends. Certainly, I can't disagree with anything that any of our the panelists have said. From our perspective, one of the things that we can, and one of the big reasons that we've changed from the guidelines to the set of interrelated standards is to accommodate and be flexible, with regard to emerging reporting needs. Whether it's in support of what the EU directive will drive companies to disclose or the member states require, or whether it's integrating into putting elements of sustainability topics into an integrated report and others. Part of what we've done is from a GRI standpoint, is to help facilitate that. It also allows us to update and make changes on a much more timely basis instead of the 3 to 5 gestation period from G3 to G4, and there will be no G5. We now have GRI standards, so these are not G5 in disguise. But part of what we want to continue, and why we believe that the dialogue that Sarah mentioned around the corporate reporting dialogue is important, because each of our frameworks there are different reporting needs. There are needs that investors have, and there's a great deal of attention on investors, of course. But there's also other stakeholders' needs. And one of the things that we see is that there is, I think, some continued confusion around this question of materiality, and it's always a material to whom and for what purpose. And so reporting needs to be looked at in the context of what it is we're trying to illuminate. What are we trying to illustrate? Who are we trying to communicate to? And from a GRI standpoint, we want to make sure that we keep a focus on this is about how companies can make better informed decisions, certainly, and that's what will ultimately make the difference. But to the extent that we're reporting on this, we don't want to lose the idea that we're asking companies to report on their sustainability impacts, and that impacts on sustainable development. And that goes far beyond, what an individual investor or set of investors may think is important. And so we'll continue to try to address, the idea that this really ties to sustainable development, not to the sustainability of the individual entity, which is where a lot of the investor focus, of course, is, and rightly so. But we believe that there continues to be a need to understand holistically what the company is having an impact on sustainable development, which is why we've now have a further collaboration with the UN Global Compact around the SDGs. So I'm glad that they were raised. And trying to understand, what are the gaps in what is expected under the SDGs, the 17 goals, and then the 169 actions or tasks underneath those. How can businesses, entities illuminate their contribution to those or lack thereof? And so we're working in collaboration with UNGC PRI will be part of that, the WBCSD, and others, as we look to what are the missing indicators to understand how businesses can actually contribute to the SDGs. So that'll be an important piece of work going on in the next few months. The other piece I would say, and we've talked about it a little bit in terms of the supply chain, and I realize it's next door, but SMEs are a big piece of supply chains, and so one of the things that we think continues to be important and what we're trying to help with is at the very small and medium-sized enterprises in these emerging economies in particular, how can we help them understand that they need to act responsibly in a sustainable fashion as they try to emerge or grow on their economic basis and participate in global supply chains in a responsible fashion. And so we're working with the Swiss government and others in terms of how to apply the standards in an SME environment so they can illustrate, one, they understand their responsibilities, but also how they participate in these global supply chains. So with that, questions? Let's see. So we have a question here. What trends do you see in terms of issues that will impact sustainability, i.e. reporting beyond the first tier of supply chains and human rights, and can you pick out any specific issues?
Oh, isn't me? Yeah, I guess.
Well, you're our corporate reporter
Exactly.
representative here.
Yeah, again, I guess in terms of human rights, the Modern Slavery Act in the UK is huge. I think we're reporting on it in 2017 based on the 2016 information. A lot of companies were building their reporting systems around it, and this relates directly to the supply chain issues. And I think what we are seeing at Barclays is, we're a bank, so we don't have a huge supply chain, as you can imagine, but we do still work with our suppliers. And I think for us, we're gradually moving into bringing them on board with all the sustainability requirements that are there. And I guess it's it's a journey. It's a long process. We started with environmental data that we're trying to capture, but I think it will go, as a domino effect. Eventually, the suppliers, especially all the kind of nearest and dearest, will have to report on the same scope as a company as we're going deeper and deeper into what are the risks and how the company's reputation can be affected by those companies within its supply chain. The gender pay gap, but this is UK, I guess, more UK driven. But I think UK is really at the moment is driving a lot of this, sector specific disclosures. So watch this space. I guess other countries will pick this up. And the EU non-financial directive, we're definitely looking into this space.
How did you answer the question?
I think, I just painted the picture. I don't have all the answers, sorry.
No, I think I was reading one of these kind of analysis reports. I think it's nearly 90% of businesses who report on sustainability now mention that human rights and supply chain is important to them, but it's only about a third actually talk about what they're doing. So it's that immersion of data into that. It's actually talking about specific things that are happening on human rights. And I think you touched on something there that makes it really apparent. Environmental data is, for the most part, numbers. So many tons of this. It's easy. When you start talking about qualitative rather than quantitative data, which is not something you want to say when you're on a table because it's quite tricky, it's going to be much harder to talk about that authentically because the data doesn't lend itself to easy analysis. You can talk about billions of dollars donated, thousands of dollars donated, and you can talk about hours given, but talking about specific outcomes when some of the projects are quite small or some of the outcomes are quite complex, it doesn't lend itself to this percentage or this pie chart. And so finding ways to talk about that is going to be, I think, one of the challenges. Mm-hmm. The data will be there. I don't think at the moment there's a clever shortcut to actually having that human piece of work looking through that data to find what those stories are.
Well, certainly, I think you're right, and this raises the question of of boundaries and what is the reporting entity actually taking responsibility for as they gather their information. So I don't know, Sarah, if you have I know from an IRC framework standpoint, because I was on the working group, but this question of boundary and how far down into a supply chain or up into a value chain as an organization should they be looking, and how do we strike that balance?
I think it's a challenge, and I think different organisations are currently, on a continuum, but there's no doubt that organisations can no longer just think about value creation for the organisation itself. They have to also think about value creation for others. And I think, I don't think the best way of doing this is necessarily going to come from regulation and different specific requirements coming over the hill, although those will prevent things dropping too low, and you do have to have that sort of regulatory safety net. But I think what we're seeing is the kind of innovation and bright ideas coming from companies themselves, and the market, the capital market and the cost of capital and the longer term investment coming to those companies who are demonstrating that maturity, that they can talk about the outcomes for their human capital, for example, and therefore they're demonstrating that they've got savvy management, forward thinking, etc. And I think it's going to be both the safety net of regulation and requirements and companies learning from other organisations who are starting to have good ideas and get ahead with that maturity of information.
Okay. Any other response?
No, I think, you talk about the safety net. I mean, the one thing that certainly I get to talk about quite a lot in the States, which is fun, is the Yates memo. This was, I think you might have caught this, which was from the US Department of Justice, which is basically a statement of intent that they are now no longer going to seek to punish companies for non-compliance. They are going to seek to punish those they see as responsible, which is a cultural shift for them, and has certainly pricked up a few years over that side of the Atlantic. I think you're right that when you look at innovation, it doesn't come from legislation, but when you look at kind of raising the tide for everyone,
Raising the bar,
that does come from legislation. I'm much more excited about the companies who want to lead the way, but it's nice that there is that kind of safety, the safety net of legislation pushing it forwards.
Okay, so maybe, I'm not seeing too many questions being typed in, but maybe we take some questions from the audience, and while you're thinking about that, okay, yes.
Good morning. My name is Peter Knight. I'm the chairman of the Context Group. We've been helping companies report for over 20 years. How do you see all the complementary, conflicting standards and guidelines, the IRC, the GRI, now the EC, where do you, and SASB in the US, where do you see this all ending up?
It's a very good question.
Well, I have an answer, but I'm the moderator's, but
I think you guys have to take this.
So, where it ends up is, I'm not smart enough to know where it ends up, but I know what journey we're on. And that is really around what was Sarah mentioned on this corporate reporting dialogue, is that it starts with an understanding and a clear articulation of what each of us are trying to solve for. And I think we've come a long way in the last couple of years as determining, what are we trying to solve for? And so if you wanted to pick off each of them, I could describe for you, where I see, what the benefit is. And so you mentioned SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board in the U.S., and I would say that, there's not an equivalency, and I think sometimes people believe that there's a binary choice here, if you can do a SASB report or a GRI report or an IRC report. And the reality is you can't actually do a SASB report. It has a series of indicators that need to be plugged into a reporting format or framework, such as a GRI report, which is where we're seeing them pop in now, or their preferred approach is to put it into MD&A and a US SEC filing. So it's a very useful exercise and some very useful information coming out from it, but there is not as much confusion or disputing amongst us all as folks would like to make it out to be. because I do think we have particular purposes in mind. As I mentioned, ours is really around a focus on illuminating the sustainability impacts that a company has, without particularly a focus on investors only, and in fact, quite the opposite in some respects. So we're trying to, but I think having the dialogue and having the discussions, which we have now on an increasingly regular basis, and hopefully more so when we have our new chairperson of the CRD, to help understand that. Because I don't know that there's ever going to be one size fits all, because we have different purposes and we have different needs. And unless everybody in the world agrees that with everyone else as to what their informational reporting needs are, then we're likely to continue to have some. But I believe alignment and the kind of things that we have, for instance, with GRI, with the linkage document, with how a CDP and GRI and CDP UN Global Compact and GRI fit together, hopefully will help people understand that there are different purposes here. And as long as those purposes remain valid, then there's likely to be some differences. So,
Yes.
Sarah?
I completely agree with that, Eric. And I think it's going to be for companies to think, individually, and yes, probably there are trends in certain industries or certain jurisdictions, but if the company itself is thinking, what am I trying to do here? Who are the stakeholders, the priority stakeholders that I need to communicate with? What is important to run my business internally? And as an outcome of that sort of integrated management and integrated thinking internally, what do I need to report to who? And I think there will continue to be, there's more and more information, so there will continue to be that detailed level of information. But I think increasingly the standards and the frameworks help to bring that together. And the IR framework is only a set of high-level principles. It's only 30 pages long, and depending on who you are and who you're trying to report to, you will need to use the financial reporting standards and other standards to report properly on various elements of information. So I see companies sort of just working out what makes sense for them, and already there's a bit of a better understanding of which standards make sense for them, because for example, natural capital is critical for their organisation, and therefore they will look at all the standards on natural capital and work out what's useful for them.
Other question? So I have one, and I'll put our corporate representative on the spot again. How do you avoid just reporting on good news? I mean, how do you strike this balance of what the what else is going on other than all the things that are going really well?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question, and I think, as you all probably know, we learned it the hard way. So I think we no longer have this fear of actually admitting that we did something wrong. Although there is a safety net, if you like, in terms of there were a lot of work put into code of conduct and kind of making sure that financial institution like ours wouldn't slip into the same hole as we did a couple of years ago. But I guess it's a lot to do internally with with talking with different people and putting everyone kind of on the same page, because not everyone in the organization as big as Barclays would think in a kind of in a sustainable way, if you'd like, in terms of a lot of people are still focused on their kind of day-to-day very specific tasks. So our job as a kind of citizenship representatives is just making them up to speed with all the what are the external requirements, what are the stakeholders are listening or wanting to hear from us, putting a lot into benchmarking against our competitors and what others are doing, and then convincing them that it's actually a good thing to be open and transparent. But as I said, I think in the banking sector, it's people are used to telling bad news, which is a good thing and a bad thing. But I know for a lot of other industries, especially extractives, that was a huge goal still. remain. So
Not sure whether Wells Fargo would agree with that in terms of the.
yeah, well, I mean, I can
Really
only
bad
speak
news,
for
but-
yeah
No,
for,
no, I
for
understand.
Barclays.
I think we have time for.
Can I ask?
Oh, yeah, you can.
Actually, a retaliation notice. No, in terms of the sector-specific disclosures, I think previously GRI was really, well, I mean, we still rely on your sector-specific disclosures, but where is it going now with the standard? And, you know, are you planning on updating?
Yeah, so great question. And what we have done at this stage was to make the transition from the guidelines to the set of interrelated standards. Where sector disclosures come in, the thinking of the GSSB board, the Global Sustainability Standards Board, which is the independent standard-setting board that GRI set up, is thinking that for the most part, the sector level disclosures will be recommendations as opposed to required disclosure elements. Now that may change, but the thinking is that at a sector level, once you've identified what your material issues are, and then you have described how you're managing those issues and what the risk approach to them are, and then it's a matter of determining what are the best KPIs or metrics, a way of illuminating how you are progressing on that particular dimension. Those will become the recommended disclosures at an industry level. So currently, to get down to practical matters, we have 10 sector recommendations currently. We have on the docket the build out of significantly more of those. And this takes us to the relationship and the interaction to have with SASB, because they have spent the last 3 years developing very industry specific, but from a financial materiality lens and specifically for use or for the benefit of investors. And so from a GRI standpoint, we're keenly interested in other stakeholders' perspectives other than investors. And so we'll be looking to build out, as I mentioned, in a GRI report, a G4 report today, or certainly a GRI standards report in the future. A company is expected to pick, the kinds of KPIs or metrics that best illustrate, how they're handling a material topic. And so whether or not there exists a particular GRI metric for that, a standard on that particular topic, there is an expectation that companies will look around and provide in their reporting, those indicators, those metrics that would best illustrate it. And so, and we see that not as much as we would like, but we do see that, and that's, as I mentioned, where we're seeing the use by some GRI reporters, taking advantage of what SASB has done and say, this one best illustrates in my particular industry, how I want to describe the impact that I'm having on a broad set of stakeholders, in addition to investors.
Thank you.
I think we're done. Okay. I want to thank my panelists. So thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you.